Hey, welcome back to Connection Point Studies. We're starting a brand new series called The Voice. Now, I have to tell you, Ron, last whole series that we did, some people never got out of the warm-up question. What's a good marriage? They never got past that. It was hilarious. And so that's okay. You know, as a connection group, you guys need to take what we do and try and design it for your group and make it as good as possible to connect with each other in every way possible. So, today we start this series called The Voice, and there's kind of this television program, The Voice, where you listen to the voice, and the question that we're asking is, whose voice are you listening to? So, in this first study, let's ask a warm-up question around the voice.
Yeah. So, we were thinking about when you're a kid, there are some voices that are a little scary, you know? So, the question is, whose voice scared you when you were growing up, and what about now?
Yeah, who are you afraid of now? And before you come back, read 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 through 10, and we'll come back ready to talk about it. So, Ron, whose voice were you afraid of?
Oh, it's got to be Dad.
Yeah, it was.
You know, there's a reason why Mom said, "Wait till your father gets home."
That's true. How about now, Ron? Is it our wives?
Ooh, I don't want to hear that voice right now.
I know, but I mean, truthfully, when we know we're in trouble, and if it's our wives, it's because we know we're in trouble.
It's also the eyes, too.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. Well, hopefully we're not in too much trouble, but we're really talking about the voice of confession, and they've read 1 John 1 through 10 here.
Yeah.
And so let's give them a little, before we get to the first question, let's give them a little background of this whole book, so it kind of sets it as a foundation.
Yeah, so this book, of course, was written by John, one of the 12 disciples. He was perhaps the closest disciple to Jesus. He often referred to himself as the disciple who Jesus loved, right? He talked about this very close relationship. You find whenever there was a subgroup of the disciples that went off with Jesus, it was Peter, James, and John, right? Yeah. Those three always together. And so John was later in life now, he was referred to as John the Elder. He wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and the book of Revelation. He was widely recognized as kind of a leading figure in the early church.
Well, and many of the rest of the disciples had died, right? The apostles had died. I don't know by this time, but eventually it would only be John left.
Yeah, right. He was the only one who died a natural death.
Right, on an island.
Yes,
all by
right.
himself. He also wrote another book called Revelation, which is interesting. Which, if you read Revelation, you can kind of understand 1 John. It's a little artsy. It's a little bit random in the way he approaches things. So as we dig into this, we're going to see the way he writes is a little different than the way Paul writes. And
absolutely. And it's also very shaped by his experiences with Jesus, and we'll see that as we go through it.
Okay, so let's get him started. First question.
Yeah, so the first question, if you look at the first 4 verses, verse 1 through 4, John makes this big deal about seen, heard, touched, and all this. And, so I'm just wondering, what is he talking about, and why does he emphasize this so much?
Verses 1 through 4. Okay, Ron, why does he emphasize this? What is it? What's really on his heart?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 things. One thing is that John wants to make it clear that he was there. Mm-hmm. We're talking about somebody who was physically there. He heard him. He touched him. He was there. And he uses we a lot. And most people think he's referring to him and the other disciples. And then also there was the earliest form of something that later came to be known as Gnosticism, was this idea that maybe Jesus wasn't really a man. Maybe he was like a spirit. And so, John wants to make it clear that, no, I was there. I really touched this guy.
In fact, I think this is almost his way of saying, I have some scientific proof. I measured it, I felt it, I touched it, I heard it. This is real. This is real. So he establishes that his relationship with Jesus was real, that Jesus was real, he saw it, he heard it. And now we go to the second question that kind of digs in deeper.
Yeah, so the second question is that John says that they have this message. We're declaring this message, And so this is pretty key. So like, this is the message. Here it is. What is it in verse 5?
All right, the message, the central message, there it is. Tell us what is it in that verse 5?
Yeah, he says, God is light, and in him there's no darkness at all.
Which means he's the source of light. The only way there can be no shadows or darkness is that he is the source of all light.
Yeah, and on the surface you look at this and go, well, duh, no darkness, okay? But you know, this lays a foundation for a lot of things he's going to explain later, because people always have to grapple with darkness and light in our lives, right? And so some people were saying like, well, you know, Jesus probably had darkness too, and you know, he was like us, darkness, light, you know, and so, and he's like, no darkness at all.
He was light. Yeah, it's powerful. And when we bring him into our lives, he's light. It's a wonderful, powerful image. I love that image. Now, as we dig a little bit deeper, he changes. Let's look at question 3 here.
Yeah, so the third question is, John talks about 2 ways of walking. And, you know, when he's saying walking, he doesn't mean like, you know, you walk down the street. He's talking about a pattern of life. And so he says there's 2 ways of walking in verses 6 and 7. What does he say about those 2 ways of walking?
What's interesting to me, Ron, is that he goes from saying Jesus is light, now he takes almost a different analogy. It's like he's switching gears now, and he starts talking about walking. So it is kind of interesting, but so explain the walking. What are the 2 ways of walking?
Yeah, so he says, well, there's one who says, oh, I have fellowship with him, and which is the Greek word koinonia, and it's this close relationship. I have this close relationship with him, but I walk in darkness. And so, you know, there was one kind of person who was saying like, yeah, you could totally be with Christ, but the way you live really doesn't matter. And so John says, no, that's a lie. You're doing that, you're a liar, right? And then another one walks in the light, and he's cleansed from all sin.
Right. So there's a very different person. And that's really what happens, is when you start to bring God into your life, it changes you from the inside out. So let's go a little bit further. Question 4. And the question you ask here is, what does John say about sin in verses 7 through 10? And then who does this apply to? So let's talk about that.
So one thing you have to be careful about when you're studying the Bible is you don't want to base everything on one verse. And so you want to look at, what does the Bible say about this thing in other places? And so here we're looking at John. What does Paul say? What does Peter say? And all of that. So one of the conclusions you could come to if you look at this verse where he says, those who walk in the light are cleansed from sin, is you might think, oh, so John is saying if we want to get cleansed from sin, we got to clean up our lives and walk in the light. And yet Paul makes it really clear, you can't clean up your life. You need Jesus to save you first, right? And Jesus saves you, and as part of that process, you're being cleansed and changes your life, and you know, it's cleansed by faith, not by walking in light, right?
I think a part of what John's saying here, just my opinion, is that as you invite the light, Jesus Christ, into your life, that's the cleansing. That's the faith to invite him in, and then that changes our walk because we see the walk differently. So even as we look at this, you have to look at the way that you view him. It's not something we do. This is something he does in us, right?
Exactly. And the other thing John says, which is so important to remember as we look at all of 1 John, because this will come up over and over again, sometimes the way John talks, it makes it sound like Christians don't sin. They're perfect. They never sin. And yet, we find right here in verse 8, he says, if we say we have no sin, we're deceiving ourselves. Right. So, okay, great. And then he says, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just, will forgive us and purify us. So as you read the rest of John, where he's talking about all these things that make you think, wow, sometimes I mess up. Does that mean I'm not saved? Remember this verse.
Yeah, and I love this. I love this picture of this verse, which is as things come to light in our life, when we know we've done the wrong thing, we confess it. It's the voice of confession.
Yeah.
It's admitting our errors that begins to help us change. So let's look at verse 5 here, or question 5 here.
Yeah, so the last question is really just kind of why. Why does John bother saying all these things? I mean, what difference does it make really in your life to understand this?
This is kind of an application question, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And in my life, I can think of what difference it makes in my life. Every time I own up to my sins, every time I confess, and every time I let his light change, it changes me. It helps me. If I don't, no more excuses, no more, just I own up to my stuff.
Yeah, in fact, it's very interesting when you look at the Greek word for confess. It's homologeo. It means to say the same thing. So God says, that's wrong. And then when you confess, you say, you know, God, I did that and it was wrong. I agree with you.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of freedom in that.
There is.
Yeah. And you know, the other thing I think that's really interesting about the way John talks about this is he wants you to know that there's hope for you. And I've seen it happen where people will come to church and they'll say, oh, I'm going to get my life cleaned up, and I'm going to work really hard. And, you know, for a little while, you might be able to pull it off, but eventually, sooner or later, you're going to mess up, or you're going to realize that you're not as good as you wanted to be. And some people at that place get so discouraged, they say, well, you know, maybe other people can do this, but I probably can't.
Yeah. And he doesn't want you to be discouraged. He wants you to stay at it. So really, that's what this all amounts to. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this, and we encourage you to take a little bit of time and pray together as a group and get around, and maybe even in your own life, just make it a point of making this a point of change in your life. To confess means that you agree with God about your life, and you let him change you with his light. So I encourage you to do that. Pray for each other, and we'll see you next week at Connection Point Studies.